Hi folks, my name is Phil and welcome to Grounded, the series which looks at airlines of yesteryear. This episode will take a look at Chalk's Ocean Airways. When one thinks of the world's oldest airlines, they're likely to think of Pan Am, KLM or Qantas. It's actually still an argument that goes on today, but a few years ago it was even more contentious. Chalk's Ocean Airways was claiming that they were in fact the oldest, though depending upon where one started counting from, it was either by a wide margin or a gnat's hair. Back in 1911 in the town of Paducah, Kentucky, a 23-year-old mechanic named Arthur Burns Chalk had an unexpected encounter with a chap called Tony Janus. Janus was one of the early aviators. He was in town as his aircraft had encountered mechanical difficulties forcing him to land on the Ohio River. In awe of the aircraft before him, Chalk and Janus entered an agreement. Chalk would repair the aircraft engine and in return Janus would teach him how to fly. A few years later, on January the 1st, 1914, Janus would pilot the inaugural flight of the SPT airboat line from St. Petersburg to Tampa. The SPT airboat line, or St. Petersburg-Tampa airboat line, was the first scheduled airline in the world to operate fixed-wing aircraft. They only lasted 5 months, which was 2 months longer than they'd been contracted for, but they left a lasting legacy. Not too long after that, Chalk himself, by now 29, had relocated to Miami and established the Red Arrow flying service. The company office was little more than a table under a palm tree and a telephone hanging from a nearby pole. The fleet consisted of a single aircraft, a Curtiss HS-2L. Red Arrow would operate ad hoc flights, however they would soon suspend operations while Chalk served in the US Army Air Service during World War I. Upon his return, Chalk relaunched Red Arrow as Chalk's flying service, with operations resuming in February 1919. Initially this was more of the same, some ad hoc flights as well as sightseeing trips priced at $5 a go. That works out at just over $75 today. There were quite a few takers for these trips, as after all, flying was still an immense novelty for pretty much everyone. A scheduled service from Miami to Bimini in the Bahamas followed a few months later. Some things hadn't changed much. The company office was still a table sat at the edge of Biscayne Bay, but one big change was going to play right into the hand of the fledgling airline. In 1920, the United States enacted a nationwide ban on the production, transportation and sale of alcoholic beverages. The Prohibition era had begun, and a huge side effect of this was demand for travel from the dry United States to the very wet Bahamas. The Bahamas were at the time a British Crown colony, and as you may know, we Brits enjoy a good drink, so the Bahamas were a plentiful source of alcohol for bootleggers, much to the US government's chagrin. Chalk's was very popular among the bootleggers, flying them out to the islands to negotiate deals and check stocks, though to be fair, Chalk's also flew the government agents who were following the bootleggers. The Bahamas was such a reliable source of nourishment that the US government protested to the British Colonial Office. At the time, the BCO was run by a man called Winston Churchill, though he was still a good decade and a half away from his "We shall fight on the beaches" speech. His response to the US authorities was that Prohibition was an affront to the whole history of mankind, arguably his second best speech. Remember, we Brits like a drink and not just tea. In 1926, through the use of landfill, Watson Island was created in Biscayne Bay. Chalk's relocated to the newly formed island and built offices and a small terminal there. The new seaplane base was directly adjacent to the conveniently long and straight channel used by Chalk's aircraft as a runway. Chalk's also introduced 2 Sikorsky S-29 seaplanes as demand for travel increased, with Chalk himself flying 12 hours a day. Besides its regular service to the Bahamas, Chalk's had developed a bit of a charter business on the side. Their most notable charter flight took place on Saturday the 12th of August 1933, when a Chalk's aircraft was called into action to rescue the deposed Cuban president Gerardo Machado. Fleeing the country amid a hail of bullets, the Chalk's seaplane took Machado to the Bahamas. 1933 was notable for one other big event, the repeal of Prohibition. During the time of Prohibition, Al Capone himself was a fairly frequent flyer of Chalk's. However, once Prohibition had ended, Chalk's found itself very popular with a whole host of celebrities, including Ernest Hemingway, Howard Hughes, Errol Flynn, Lana Turner, Ava Gardner and Judy Garland. During World War II, Chalk's would operate hundreds of marine aerial patrols on the lookout for German U-boats. With the Chalk's fleet operating on behalf of the Civil Air Patrol, passenger services were suspended for 3 years. The end of the war would see Chalks take advantage of the military aircraft surplus, introducing the Grumman Widgeon and Grumman Goose into the fleet. Both the 5-seater Widgeon and 9-seater Goose served Chalks well, but in the 1960s the company brought in its first mallard. No, not that mallard. Not that one either. There we go. The mallard was a big step up from its predecessors. It had retractable landing gear allowing it to operate on the land as well as water, and wing-mounted floats which, aside from helping with stability on the water, could be used as additional fuel tanks. In 1964, Arthur Chalk, now known as Pappy due to his white hair, semi-retired following the death of his wife, Lily Mae Chalk, who he had been married to since 1932. Lily Mae had helped Arthur run the airline, seen together in this photograph. Chalk would continue to run the airline but stopped flying, having logged nearly 17,000 hours. He would sell the airline to his close friend, Dean Franklin, in 1966. Franklin was no stranger to the airline, having been a Chalk's pilot for 30 years by that point. By now the airline was operating a fleet of 4 Gooses, or should that be geese, and 3 mallards. The following year, 1967, would see the introduction of flights to Key West and Fort Jefferson, though Franklin's reign was to be short-lived. Edward Dixon, a local businessman, acquired the company in 1973, though the following year he sold it on again. The new owners were Resorts International. They had started out as the Mary Carter Paint Company, a paint manufacturer in New Jersey, but had since sold off the paint business, focusing instead on hotels and restaurants in the Bahamas. Pappy Chalk, who had since retired, couldn't be kept away from his company. He would visit the company base every day barring Sunday. According to employees, he would bring soup and sandwiches for the staff and birdseed for, well, the birds. He didn't have a driver's license. Instead, his niece would drive him to Watson Island, wait for him, then drive him home. Unfortunately, the 89-year-old Pappy Chalk died on May 26, 1977, when he fell from a tree whilst pruning it. He was interned alongside his wife and once again reunited. Resorts International made Chalks the primary air carrier to Paradise Island, introducing service between there, Miami and West Palm Beach in 1981. They invested heavily in their latest acquisition, upgrading the fleet of Grumman mallards from radial engines to turboprops at a cost of around $4 million. The airline also introduced the larger 30-seat Grumman Albatross into the fleet, with 13 eventually joining Chalks. The mid-1980s would see Chalks gain infamy when it was featured in the closing credits of Miami Vice. To be fair, it was a quick shot, but a Chalks aircraft would feature more prominently in the Season 4 episode Baseballs of Death, where the bad guys attempt to escape on a Chalks bird, resulting in an iconic shot of a Scarab speedboat chasing the seaplane. Chalks aircraft would feature in a number of videos during the 1980s. Aside from Miami Vice, they featured in a George Michael music video and one of the final scenes of Silence of the Lambs. James Crosby was the owner of Resorts International and a huge supporter of Chalks. However, in 1986 he died unexpectedly at the age of 59. Crosby didn't leave behind any heirs. While his sisters took control of Resorts International, it was easy pickings for a takeover. In 1987, Donald Trump acquired the company and, in an attempt at cutting costs, cut the fleet to just 4 mallards and withdrew the entire 13-strong Albatross fleet. After decimating Chalks, he sold Resorts International and Chalks to Merv Griffin Enterprises the following year. This would sadly not be the Orange One's only foray into aviation, but that is an episode for another day. Chalks' days were looking numbered under the new regime when Resorts International built a 3,000-foot long runway on Paradise Island, as Chalks aircraft were unable to use it. Paradise Island Airways launched in March 1989, operating 3 de Havilland Dash 7 turboprops between Paradise Island and Florida. The Dash 7 was a STOL, or short takeoff and landing aircraft, and was able to use the new runway. They had a capacity of 50 passengers and were faster than the Chalks flying boats. Crucially, however, they were owned by Resorts International. The two airlines flew a combined 60,000 passengers annually, but Chalks carried barely a quarter of that total. This was a fraction of the 130,000 passengers carried by Chalks a few years earlier, before their fleet had been stripped of the larger Albatrosses. 1991 would see Chalks sold to the United Capital Corporation of Rockford, Illinois, a venture capital company not affiliated with United Airlines. The company was owned by Seth and Connie Atwood. They were both big fans of seaplanes and wanted to see Chalks return to glory after a few tough years. By now, the final blows from Resort International's ownership had left the fleet at just 4 aircraft and a route structure limited to Miami and Fort Lauderdale to Bimini. Things were looking up though. The airline operated its first scheduled domestic flight following the introduction of flights from Miami to the Florida Keys. The airline also carried around 30,000 passengers, a big step up from 2 years earlier, and a fifth mallard joined the fleet. Tragedy would soon strike, however, when in March 1994 a Grumman mallard operating an empty ferry flight crashed on takeoff. The aircraft had dropped 13 passengers off at Christmas Tree Island and was set to make a short 5-mile flight to Key West Airport, where it would pick up passengers bound for Miami. For whatever reason, the pilots didn't complete the pre-takeoff checklist. This checklist calls for the bilge pumps to be turned on before departure, as the seaplane, just like a boat, will take on water. Unfortunately, the aircraft had also developed a small leak, so was taking on more water than usual. When the aircraft lifted off, the water shifted further aft, causing the aircraft to stall and crash into the sea. It sank in 30 feet of water with the loss of both crew, First Officer Alan Turner and Captain John Alberto, who was at the time the airline's chief pilot. This was the first fatal accident in the company's 75-year history, but unfortunately it wouldn't be its last. In 1996, a group of investors acquired Chalks for around $5 million. The consortium included Chuck Slagle, the owner of Alaska's Seaborne Aviation, and Chuck Cobb, who at the time held the rights to the Pan Am name, having snapped them up following the death of the aviation icon. Chalks would soon begin operating flights under the name Pan Am Airbridge, which was a little ironic considering they were at one-time competition. In 1997, the company was sold yet again. Air Alaska, an aircraft leasing company headquartered in Dallas, Texas, acquired a 70% stake in Chalks. They bought out the 3 primary investors for $8 million, of which $2 million was paid in cash, with the remaining $6 million in debt. In a separate deal, they purchased the 5 Grumman mallards, with both deals concluding in January 1998. Chalks was still operating under the Pan Am Airbridge name, with Pan Am still owning a 30% stake in the company. Pan Am themselves were soon acquired by Guilford Transportation Industries, who had big plans. GTI were briefly mentioned in my Kiwi episode. They were a railroad operator who made moves into the aviation industry. They had acquired Pan Am and were looking at having a real go of reviving the iconic name. Unfortunately, Pan Am's second or possibly third incarnation by this point was a huge mess. To further compound the problems, Air Alaska declared bankruptcy in early 1999. Chalks themselves were forced into bankruptcy that January when 6 creditors filed suit against the airline. The company had debts totaling more than $1.5 million, of which over $400,000 was in back taxes. Chalks had not always been profitable, but this was their first ever bankruptcy. Chalks was almost certainly doomed. The airline's operating insurance was 3 days away from expiring, and the company didn't have the money to renew it. If the insurance expired, they would have been grounded with little hope of a return. Bill Jones, who had been the airline's manager until leaving following a dispute with Pan Am and GTI, was brought back by the court-appointed trustee. Jones managed to secure interim financing, allowing Chalks to continue operating for a few more months at least. A full rescue soon came in the form of John Confalone, a 56-year-old former Eastern Airlines pilot. He acquired Chalks for $925,000 in August 1999, having sold his beachfront home to finance the acquisition. He wanted to return Chalks back to its glory days, but he had his work cut out. The airline had been able to operate during its bankruptcy, however its fleet had been reduced to just 2 aircraft, with its workforce slashed to 35 employees. He admitted that the company was far too small to be profitable, but he said that he'd felt like he'd been entrusted to take care of it, and that these large seaplanes landing in Miami are what the cable cars are to San Francisco in terms of a tourist attraction. Confalone bought 5 mallards and also had discussions with Chalk's former owner Seth Atwood about bringing the 14 albatrosses back, though the airline would never operate them again. The Pan Am Airbridge name was dropped for good, with the company rebranding as Chalk's Ocean Airways on December 17, 1999. Things were once again looking up for Chalks. The short runway in Paradise Island closed, with the knock-on effect being that Paradise Island Airways, its former sibling which had forced it out of their family home, had ceased operations. With its runway closed, Chalks was once again the only operator to the island. Add to that, the increase in popularity of the Bahamas as they became more affordable to regular folks meant that for Chalks, it looked like it had a bright future ahead. In the year 2000, Chalks began flying between Fort Lauderdale and Freeport in Grand Bahama as well. The September 11th attacks affected all the US airlines, including Chalk's. While they cut their schedules by 25% and reduced the fleet to 3 mallards, the biggest effect was in 2004. Chalk's was forced out of its Watson Island base by the authorities. There were several reasons for this. There was of course the proximity to the port of Miami, the largest passenger port in the world, and fears of an aircraft attack. There was also an increase in helicopter traffic, making it harder for Chalk seaplanes to take off and land safely. Finally, there was the Watson Island terminal itself, for it was the smallest entry point into the US, and the customs and immigration authorities were getting stricter and in a way outgrowing the existing facilities. The company was forced to leave Miami, relocating to Fort Lauderdale where the company already had a presence. They'd been operating flights from there for several years already, and it was home to the Chalk's aircraft maintenance base as well as the company's administrative offices. It looked like a minor but inconvenient setback, though just a few months later tragedy would strike Chalk's once again. On Monday, December 19, 2005, Chalk's Ocean Airways Flight 101 left Fort Lauderdale, scheduled to fly to Bimini with 2 pilots and 16 passengers. The aircraft, November 2969, which had featured prominently in Miami Vice nearly 20 years earlier, made a detour. It landed in Biscayne Bay to pick up 2 additional passengers from the former Watson Island terminal. This was of course most unusual, as Chalk's had stopped using the site the previous year. However, the 2 passengers were considered VIPs, the great-great-grandson of the founder of Bacardi along with his wife. The 58-year-old Grumman Mallard departed just after 2:30 p.m. on what would be its 39,744th flight. Minutes after takeoff, whilst climbing through 500 feet over Government Cut, a man-made shipping channel, the aircraft's right wing separated from the fuselage. Leaking fuel caused an explosion as the wreckage tumbled to the water below. Both pilots and all 18 passengers were killed. The immediate aftermath saw the Chalk's fleet grounded pending safety inspections. In fact, the FAA grounded every Grumman Mallard in the US until they could be inspected. The following year, the company hoped to resume operations under the name Chalk's International Airlines, one previously used by the company but also reflecting that it no longer operated seaplanes. Regulatory issues prevented Chalk's from operating aircraft itself, so the company was forced to wet lease aircraft from Biscayne Airlines. This wouldn't go to plan though, as an administrative mix-up had not only allowed Chalk's route licence to the Bahamas to expire, but that the approval by the US authorities for Biscayne to operate on Chalk's behalf was not recognised by the Bahamian authorities. This meant that Chalk's and Biscayne couldn't operate to the Bahamas from November 9th as planned. Instead, they were left to focus on a domestic network. Biscayne Airlines, a Montana-based operator, would operate a single Beech 1900D for Chalk's with flights from Fort Lauderdale to Key West and St. Petersburg. Biscayne would also find themselves with financial problems of their own. The result of this was that Chalk's had to find a new operator. They would now charter 2 Saab turboprops from Bimini Island Air. Chalk's returned to the Bahamas in the summer of 2007 with flights from Palm Beach to Freeport, Nassau and Marsh Harbour. Demand was low, however, with the airline carrying just 14 passengers in the entire month of August. Chalk's International Airlines quietly ceased operations on September 3, 2007. Shortly afterwards, the US Federal Aviation Administration revoked the company's licenses and certification. The oldest airline in the world, which had outlasted a world war and 15 presidents, had been a Miami icon and immortalised in TV and film, went out with barely even a whimper. So, what went wrong? There were several issues with Chalk's, though the majority of these would only come to light during the investigation following the crash of Flight 101. It was revealed that Chalk's had been losing money for several years, reportedly making a combined loss of $1.5 million during 2001 and 2002. The airline's owner, John Confalone, had tried to sell the airline in the spring of 2005. However, the $4.5 million deal collapsed, as did a subsequent $10 million deal. In the aftermath of Flight 101, the airline's insurers, AIG, gave Chalk's $450,000 to distribute to the victims' families as an interim payment, but the airline was so short on money that they used half of the funds to pay the staff salaries. Even right at the end, in their final months, the company was on the verge of being booted out of Fort Lauderdale. It had not paid its bills since April, racking up over $11,000 in landing and terminal fees. The airline was both blessed and cursed by its Grumman Mallard seaplanes. They were pretty to look at and looked glamorous whilst arriving and departing Biscayne Bay or the shores of Bimini, however they were expensive to maintain. They were, after all, seaplanes. Effectively, one was maintaining both a boat and an aircraft. Some Mallards were acquired purely for parts, others, by the late 90s, were withdrawn from Chalk's own fleet to be cannibalised for parts to keep the others going. This was a harsh necessity. Grumman had only manufactured 60 Mallards between 1947 and 1951. Spare parts were hard to come by in the later years, especially after the 1980s when Chalk's was the only commercial operator of the type. The money issues had led to numerous maintenance problems, and they were the root cause of the crash. The crash left the airline without a fleet, but it had also knocked passenger confidence in the airline. The two combined made it almost impossible for the airline to resume operations, though to be fair, they did try. While I could blame the downfall of Chalk's entirely on the crash of Flight 101, that would be like blaming the crash of Flight 90 for being the only reason Air Florida went bust. For me, the downfall of Chalk's began in the mid-1980s. When Resorts International acquired Chalk's, they invested heavily in the company, overhauling the fleet, converting the engines to a more reliable and fuel-efficient variant, and even introducing a huge fleet of much larger seaplanes. Unfortunately, the untimely death of RI's owner, James Crosby, in 1986 was where Chalk's fortunes took a downward turn. While it was pretty much business as usual for a few months in the immediate aftermath, it was Donald Trump's takeover of Resorts International that would see the beginning of the end for Chalk's. The company was decimated, the fleet axed to just 4 Mallards with the 13-strong Albatross fleet withdrawn. While it was done in the name of cutting costs, it made Chalk's too small to be profitable, and though Trump sold the group to Merv Griffin the following year, he had ideas of his own. He built a small runway on land and set up a competing airline, focusing entirely on that rather than his iconic Chalk's. Within 3 years, Chalk's had gone from carrying 130,000 passengers a year to barely 15,000. Changing owners several times over the decades didn't help either, as there couldn't be any long-term strategy. Then there was the whole Pan Am Air Bridge mess that nearly finished Chalk's off too. Some of the owners had the best intentions, but unfortunately, with a glamorous fleet of old gulls like the Grumman Mallard, best intentions won't keep an airline going for long. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I like covering aviation oddities just as much conventional carriers, and I welcome any feedback or suggestions for future episodes. I do more than just my Grounded series too. There are trip reports, wing views and spotting videos, all of which can be found on my website. Failing that, subscribe to catch my videos as they drop, and until next time, thanks for watching.